In Chapter 7, we're going to talk about the presidency. As you see here, this is a picture of the last four American presidents, right? Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump. This chapter deals with the power of the president and various aspects of the people who work closest with the President of the United States. In Chapter 8, we'll talk a little bit more about the bureaucracy or the rest of the executive branch that works for and with the President. The biggest problem with selecting a president is that the kind of person who would want to be president is probably the kind of person who you most have to be frightened of having them be president. Right? Presidents, by their nature, are ambitious. Any person who wakes up one morning and looks in the mirror and says, yes, I can fix everything wrong, or I want to be the person who's in charge, or I want everybody to look up to me, is potentially a person who you might not want to trust such things to. Napoleon Bonaparte, a great example of somebody who was the general who saved France, and then one day looked in the mirror or whatever he did, and decided that Napoleon Bonaparte should be the emperor of France. Well, the American system is designed a little bit to limit the ability of Napoleons, and while at the same time we need to have somebody who, as the Constitution vests in the president in a single executive, all of the executive authority of the country, we need to both rein that person in, and we need to have somebody who has that kind of power in order to oversee all of our government. Abraham Lincoln talked about the kind of person who we're worried about here, and he says that this lust for power, it scorns to tread in the footsteps of any predecessor, however illustrious. It thirsts and burns for a distinction, and if possible, it will have it, whether at the expense of emancipating slaves or of its enslaving freemen. He was talking about Napoleon, or he was envisioning Napoleon, but he was also talking a lot about that power, the power to do good and the power to do evil. And this is the challenge of the American presidency. Eisenhower, I suppose, stands in uh, as a mirror image of Napoleon, the great American general who won the Second World War and then was a rather reluctant presidential candidate. He was essentially offered up the nomination, not having to have done anything much to capture it by the Republicans. Um, Eisenhower is also an example of someone who's warned against what came to be called the military industrial complex, or this power that comes from both having the people who are protecting us also be the people who benefit the most from protecting us. The president's job is to solve the coordination problem. We talked about the coordination problem earlier in the semester, uh, and it doesn't solve the problem when two people want two totally different things, but it does solve the problem when we just need to decide which amongst many choices we should take. Also, a single executive lowers transaction costs. A single executive can say, this is what we will do. Whereas if you have 3 or 5 or 7 people making the decision, then you have to have them get together in a meeting, and it might be very difficult for them to come to a consensus. In addition to the president, within the executive branch, there are many political appointees, such as the members of the president's cabinet. These are the leaders of the major governmental departments and also other people who he has brought in who have cabinet-like or cabinet-level power. For instance, the Director of National Intelligence. But they're administrators without actual real power or prestige. Most of the actual policy making occurs within the White House, and then these people are tasked with carrying it out. If you're paying close attention, you will note that what we're about to cover here is not in your textbook. The 6 powers of the president are a different way to conceptualize the powers of the president from how the textbook looks at it. The textbook compares the president's powers as head of state to his powers as head of government. And if that's how you want to look at it, I invite you to look at the textbook. However, some of the value added in this course is the recognition that there's different ways to conceptualize presidential power. One of these is a division that I picked up from Ken Coleman, who is a political scientist who writes on these issues. And Coleman divides the powers into 6 different powers, actually 5, plus the president's political power. So let's look at these here. Well, the president has power over the executive branch. Coleman actually calls this his administrative power. But his power over the executive branch is the fact that he's the leader of the executive branch and that he can issue executive orders requiring members of the cabinet departments and the agencies to carry out their tasks in certain ways. They have to be consistent with the law, but when consistent with the law, the president has a great deal of leeway. Also, this idea of executive privilege, meaning that the policy-making discussions that the president has with other government officials are supposed to be kept secret. This doesn't always work in practice, but the president can prevent people from testifying in Congress or in court, except in those areas where it relates to law breaking. The president also has legislative power, which is to say his power along with Congress to make laws. He sets the agenda through budgeting. He has a State of the Union address or an annual address to Congress where he spells out how things are going and what his legislative agenda will be. He also has the power to veto legislation, and because it's so difficult to override a veto, it's often more efficient to negotiate with a president over what he's willing to accept. Third, he has power over the judiciary. First and foremost, he nominates judges. He nominates the judge, the Senate confirms the judge, and then he has the power to appoint confirmed judges. He determines legal policy through the Department of Justice, and he can also grant pardons. So you'll look, those are powers that he has along with each of the 3 branches of government. Additionally, he has military power as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, diplomatic power. Much of this is through the State Department. He sends and receives ambassadors. He negotiates treaties. He can enter into executive agreements. These are agreements that don't require a 2/3 majority from the Senate, but often require, after he's negotiated the executive agreement, for Congress to pass laws to enact these agreements. But sometimes they're just agreements like, we'll station an aircraft carrier near your country to protect it. And then he has political power. He's the leader of his party, and he sets the agenda for his party. But probably more important is this idea of the permanent campaign. When a president is relatively popular, then people in Congress know that they have to go along with what he says if they want to maintain their position. a lot of the Republicans in the House and the Senate right now, even if they wouldn't do what the president wants as their first choice, know that they very much depend on his support in their future elections. Now, his control over the other party might be a little bit less because the leaders of the Democratic Party usually are in districts where they don't have to worry very much about the popularity of the president, right? If it's a district that was won by, say, 15% by Kamala Harris, then the president has a job approval rating at 50%, then they know that he's probably about 15% less popular in their district than he is in the average district. Presidents with job approval rating around 50% usually can influence the enactment of laws. If it's lower than that, then most people don't want to be overly associated with the president. When Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States in 1860, he was the first ever Republican president, and many, many people were lined up outside the White House to come and talk to him individually. And the president had very few people who worked for him. He had a couple private secretaries, and other than that, most of the people who worked for the government were the people who cleaned the White House, or at least for the president. Even when Franklin Roosevelt became president of the United States, a majority of the people who worked for the president actually worked at communication, switchboards and things like that, and new technology. However, in 1937, we started to see a change as the president began to try to take control of the executive branch. One of the most important of these tools is the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget not only serves as the person or the group of people who create the presidential budget, but they also go out and they inspect the work of various government agencies and help them come up with a baseline of what amount of money they would need to continue to do what they currently do. The president also has this power of executive privilege where he can prevent people who work for the government from saying certain things that are against government policy. What they've tried to do this way is remove policy making from the departments and centralize it in the White House, where they can keep better control. And they can also, the effort is to cut down on leaks. But this has led to an enormous growth in the White House staff. The current theory on how the executive branch operates, at least how it justifies its current operation, is the unitary executive doctrine. This is also related to what you'll often hear people talk about in the news as the vesting clause of Article 2. Article 2 says that the executive power is vested in a president of the United States, meaning a single person who has in himself all of the executive power. And the idea is that if the president was all-seeing and all-knowing and everywhere at once, that's omniscient, and omnipresent and omnipotent, right? If the president had all of those different characteristics, then there wouldn't need to be anybody in the executive branch except the president. But since the president can't be everywhere, and since the president can't do everything, and since he's not all powerful, he needs other people to carry on some of his tasks for him. So the unitary executive says that All the powers of the executive branch are foremost in the office of the president, and other public officials are his extensions. And short of him commanding that they break the law, they're required to do what the president says. Now, that's not how everybody sees it. And a lot of times, if to do what the president asks you to do is to violate perhaps what your goals would be for your job. And the unitary executive suggests that when you can't carry out the responsibilities that the president gives you and their legal responsibilities, that you should give up your job. It's always interesting when we discover somebody who's largely lost to history, who nevertheless has an important role in changing the world. Louis Brownlow here is an example of this type of person. The Brownlow Committee was a blue ribbon committee of people both inside and outside of government who were trying to help the president gain control of the bureaucracy in the early days of the New Deal, when the size of government was increasing dramatically, and yet the president needed to maintain a firm grip on it in order to try to take on the Great Depression. And the Brownlow Committee advocated increases in the president's staff, especially in terms of technical and policy experts. After all, the president was a great politician, and the president was very good at speaking to the American people. And he had many advisors who were very good at helping make Franklin Roosevelt look good. But he wasn't necessarily an expert in agricultural policy or military policy or railroads or any of the many things that they needed to work on. So they needed to bring in technical experts. And the Depression and World War II added greatly to the power of the president, but they also added greatly to the need to maintain control of the bureaucracy. And he recommended the creation of the executive office of the president. And these are, so unlike the White House staff, which is just part of that, when we talk about the executive office of the president, we're talking about many other people, most of whom are experts in things like economics or trade policy or intelligence that are used by the president to help him come up with his policies. And when we talk about all of the people who work for the president in addition to the president, we're talking about the institutional presidency. The executive office of the president, I list here some of, but not all of, the various people who work in the executive office of the president. The Office of Management and Budget, the White House office, the Council of Economic Advisors, the National Security Council, the Office of the Trade Representative. What you get here are hundreds of people who provide the president with insight and technical knowledge that he would not otherwise have.